This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the 1967 Six-Day War. If you're new to the podcast, this is now our 19th episode on the history of Israel-Palestine, and you can find an overview of all of our previous episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. We also have about 30-plus episodes on European history, and we'll be adding to this after our discussion today by starting a new series about Nazi Germany. The episodes will cover all of the basic things that you need to know. We'll talk about how Hitler came to power, how he established a totalitarian dictatorship, and of course, how and why the Holocaust took place. Now, if you want a deeper dive into specific topics related to Nazism, such as what was the relationship between Nazism and the occult, what were Nazi ideals of gender, what is the specific history of a place like Auschwitz, those specific episodes will be available for our Patreon subscribers only. So if you're interested in them, you can find them via Patreon. Just do a search for History Off the Page, or you can find information about it again on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. All right, enough about that. Let's talk today, as I said, about 1967. And I want to start by introducing the idea of the war a little bit by talking about its meaning. Because 1967 is much, much different than 1956, right? We talked in our last episode about Suez, and one of the points that we made was that while the Suez crisis is incredibly important for Europeans, it's incredibly important for the regional history of the Middle East and the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. For Israelis and Palestinians, the war doesn't really change a whole lot. There's loss, there's suffering, there's violence. But on the whole, we can say that 1957 looks an awful lot like 1956 with maybe some subtle small changes. 1967, on the other hand, is probably, arguably, one of the most consequential events in the entire narrative of the history of Israel and Palestine. And there are three basic reasons that kind of make it distinct and highlight its importance. And the first of these is, again, unlike 1956, the Six-Day War would lead to dramatic territorial changes, including the first expansion of the Israeli state since the 1948 War of Independence. In particular, if we're trying to understand the moment that we live in today, in 2025 as I'm recording this, the Israeli occupation of Gaza, of the Golan Heights, and especially the West Bank is such a central, fundamental part of the story leading to the war in Gaza and, of course, to Israel's response to the October 7th attacks. Why is Israel in Gaza? Why is Israel in the West Bank? It is because of the Six-Day War. Now, Israel would also occupy the Sinai Peninsula for a second time, but of course this would be returned to Egypt in 1978 during the Camp David Accords. Now, not only is this expansion important sort of in terms of understanding the present moment, okay, obviously, why are the borders where they are? Why are people fighting the battles that they're fighting? But we should also think a little bit about the meaning of what this expansion of the Israeli state was. For many Palestinians, and especially sort of people that might describe themselves as allies, right? The idea of what this is further Israeli colonial expansion. Right? They would argue the foundation of Israel was colonial to begin with. 1967 really reveals that this isn't just looking for a Jewish homeland. It really is a colonial endeavor, they would argue. But it also has meaning for Israelis. Because 1948, in some ways, the establishment of the State of Israel, yes, it is about creating a safe space for Jews, so to speak, of creating a sort of Jewish homeland, but it doesn't really result in what we would call the real Israel, the biblical Israel, right? If you imagine what Zionism is as a kind of biblical, quasi-religious endeavor, even though Zionism was secular mostly in its origins, 1967 becomes the realization of the true borders of Israel. It's the moment when not only do you have a Jewish state, but when the Jewish state will return to the land of the Jews proper, will return to the Temple Mount and the Western Wall in all of Jerusalem, will return to the territories that are talked about in the Bible as being the heart of the Jewish people, right? The Bible doesn't talk about Haifa. The Bible doesn't talk about Tel Aviv because Tel Aviv didn't even exist at that point. So in many ways, 1967 for Israelis is a realization of the true borders of Israel. It is a moment when independence is not just achieved in a kind of practical sense, but it marks the completion in many ways of the project of building or reconstructing, if you will, an Israeli nation. Again, for the first time since the year 70 AD, Jews will be able to control the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. It is the last vestiges of the original temple that was destroyed by the Romans. Of course, Jews aren't the only ones inhabiting these lands, right? They are occupied by a people. There are Palestinians living there. And this brings us to the second reason, which I kind of already hinted at a little bit. But the second reason why 1967 is so consequential, and that is because it leads to the sudden inclusion of over 1 million Palestinians who will now be in Israeli-controlled territory. And we'll talk about the consequences of this more towards the end of today's episode. But basically, this creates a sort of existential crisis for the Jewish state. Israel is a democracy. Israel was founded as a democracy. It is supposed to include the voices of all of the Jewish people living in the area, of course. But also Jews can go and emigrate to Israel and become citizens very quickly. The entire purpose of the Israeli state is in many ways to defend the rights of Jews. Now, when the Jewish state is first set up, trying to figure out how do we harmonize a democracy and how do we make the state about the Jewish people that are living there, as opposed to other minorities potentially, this is something that is on the minds of people like David Ben-Gurion. This is something on the minds of the founders of the Jewish state. When the partition is rejected and civil war breaks out, and then later on you have, of course, the first Arab-Israeli war, as these founding fathers are thinking about the state they're creating, they explicitly engage in a policy of ethnic cleansing in order to make the state Jewish, to reconcile the idea that the government represents a certain group of people, primarily, but that it is also a democracy, where people have equal rights and civic rights and things like that. And so the idea was to create an Israel that had, again, a large majority Jewish population. 1967, in some ways, erases that. 1967 gets the demographic borders of Israel plus the occupied territories to look more like what the original partition was supposed to look like. What is the place of Palestinians in an Israeli state that is explicitly Jewish, or is explicitly trying to advocate on behalf of Jews? When there's not many Palestinians there, when there's a small minority, you say, okay, that's not a big deal, right? The majority of the population is Jewish. The state should respond to the majority of the population. But once you have this incredibly large ethnic minority there, who by definition really can't become Jewish, technically people can convert, right? It's a lot harder in Judaism to convert than it is in Christianity. But what do you do with these people, right? It is a democratic society. Shouldn't their voices be heard? The short answer to this is it's complicated. Israel is not, even today, technically the full territory that it controls, right? You do have these occupied territories. Those people don't necessarily automatically get citizenship. We'll unpack this more again towards the end of the episode. But the key point that I'm trying to make here is that 1967 will solve some crises, will solve some issues, but it will create a much bigger problem in the long run. What is the place of Palestinians now that there is no land left to create a Palestine on? Or could you return some of these lands and make a Palestine? This is something that we're going to explore in this episode and then the following episode when we talk about the war itself. By the way, just to give you some numbers of what I'm talking about, the pre-1967 population of Israel, in terms of its Jewish percentage, is about 80%. That's a lot of a majority there, right? Very clear how those two ideas of the people and the religious nature of the state fit together. After 1967, if you include the occupied territories, we are talking again about a majority that is closer to 50% than 80%. Finally, one last aspect of 1967 is fundamentally important, and that is that the third defeat of Arab armies in 2 decades, in living memory, it forces Arab states to begin to change their political calculus in a way that did not occur after 1948 or 1956. After 1948, the Arab states kind of regroup and say, okay, what went wrong? Why did we lose to this upstart kind of group of Zionists here? They're not really even a state. How did they defeat us? We can fix these errors and come back again in the future and win round 2. 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser starting to get Soviet hardware, starting to build up Egypt, looking like this rising star in the Middle East. And yet, again, war with this little Israeli state goes horribly wrong. The Israelis occupy the Sinai, and it's really only international pressure that forces Israel to return to its pre-war borders. Losing again in 1967 convinces the neighboring Arab states that this prospect of overrunning the Zionist entity, that the idea of reversing 1948, this is now not going to be something that is really practical. 1967, in some ways, is an exclamation point that proves once and for all that the Israelis aren't going anywhere. And so instead of trying to kind of keep revising the map and fighting this battle about the mandate and the partition and all that over and over again, Arab leaders begin to figure out, okay, we need to come to some sort of accommodation with Israel, whether that means directly recognizing its right to exist or just kind of having this unofficial, like, we don't recognize you're there, but we see you're there. We know you're not going anywhere. Now, of course, they would fight another war in October of 1973. This is known as the Yom Kippur War. It starts on Yom Kippur when basically Arab forces sort of launch a sneak attack. It's led by the Egyptians. They go into Sinai. It ends up being kind of a stalemate, but the Egyptians do have some successes. And after it happens, Nasser's successor Anwar Sadat will approach Israeli leaders about the possibility of signing a permanent peace treaty. We couldn't get Sinai back militarily, but will you do land for peace? This becomes the kind of guiding slogan of not just the 1970s, but in some ways the 1980s and 1990s. Can Israel trade land in exchange for permanent peace? There are some other elements that kind of make that possible. One of the things that happens is that after Nasser's death, Egypt will drift away from its kind of Soviet orbit, from the Cold War position as being kind of reliable Soviet ally. And instead, as we know today, Israel and Egypt are 2 of the United States' closest allies in the region. For the Jordanians, as we'll talk about, it takes a little bit longer, but they also, in the late 1980s, renounce their claims to the West Bank. They settle a permanent peace treaty with the Israelis, and they too kind of come to an accommodation. Right? And so one can argue that 1967 makes all of this possible. We can also add to this the Iraqis. The Iraqis are kind of tangential players on the margins. They do participate in a number of these wars. But after 1967, the Iraqis kind of lose interest in the idea of fighting against Israel. Eventually, Saddam Hussein, of course, will begin to kind of emphasize the Sunni-Shiite split. This will lead to a long and bloody war with Iran starting in 1980. And so again, in terms of thinking about the meaning of 1967, one could argue that with a sort of great deal of teeth gnashing, the Arab-Israeli peace process moves forward after 1967 in a way that it did not after 48 or 56. And of course, today it's still moving forward, or it was moving forward before the October 7th attacks. One of the things that was about to happen was Saudi Arabia was about to recognize Israel and sign a peace treaty with them. These were called the Abraham Accords. And then, of course, it all got put on hold because of the Israeli reaction in Gaza. Now, I said there was going to be three major reasons why 67 is so different. I guess we could add kind of point 3A, which is the Palestinians. Because while the Arab states kind of become reconciled at least to the idea of Israeli existence or the practical reality of Israel's existence, for Palestinians, the defeat in 1967 is experienced much differently. It's not just a defeat and, oh, well, I guess we'll just go mind our own business or start worrying about other concerns that we might have. But 1967 closes off what had been the main Palestinian strategy for creating a Palestine. This had been, of course, to rely on the Arab states to come in and defeat the Israelis and to carve out and create a space for Palestine. For Palestinians, 1967 is in some ways a second Nakba. There is not the level of ethnic cleansing that we saw after 1948. So this sense of displacement, one could argue, is in some ways very different. There is, for most of the new group of refugees, there'll be about 300,000 refugees, there's not a whole lot of places for them to go, right? There is no bordering territory for them to move into. Some living in the West Bank will move deeper into Jordan. But the end result of 1967 for Palestinians is that the last vestiges of Mandate Palestine fall under Israeli control. From now on, the Israelis alone had the ability to determine the Palestinian future. Now, the flip side of this coin is that the bankruptcy of Arab efforts to solve the Palestinian question basically empowers Palestinians to try to take control of their own destiny. If I know that I can't rely on everyone else taking care of this problem for me, then the only path forward is to me to figure it out myself. And so as Palestinian nationalists like Yasser Arafat begin looking beyond the Arab states for help, they find a convenient model for continuing the conflict in Algeria. Algeria, as we've kind of hinted at times during the podcast, was the site of a massive sort of anti-colonial uprising starting in November 1954. It is incredibly bloody. It is incredibly violent. It features direct attacks on civilians by both the sort of nationalist uprising organization, which is known as the FLN, as well as by the French, who are trying to kind of carry out a counterinsurgency. One of the keys to FLN strategy in Algeria had been the use of asymmetrical violence. Asymmetrical violence means you're using sort of guerrilla tactics to try to fight the war. I don't have an army large enough or modernized enough or full of enough weapons to be able to directly fight a war with a major European power like France. So the answer is that I hide in the jungle, I hide in urban populations, I try to pick my battles and my spots where I can maximize my power versus the soft spots of the enemy. And basically what the FLN realized after about a year of fighting is that the number one sort of target, the most effective target, is not the French military to go after, but French civilians. If I attack French civilians, I anger the military and they will respond disproportionately, They will kill innocent Arab civilians as well as a few militants along the way. And this cycle of violence produces outrage. It makes it impossible for people to meet in the middle, for people to say, well, yes, I'm Arab, but I do like our connection to France. I want some reforms of it. That middle ground gets erased. How can you be friendly with those people who are killing our people? It annihilates, in other words, the common spaces where Algerians and French colonists had been able to coexist. Now, of course, we could go into a lot more history about Algeria and France and everything going on there, but the broader point is that when Palestinian leaders begin looking around after 1967 about what do we do about Israel, they say to themselves, the Israelis are just like the French Pied Noir. The Israelis are Europeans. They are colonists. They are not really here because of the attachment to the land. They're here because they're greedy. They're here because they want to consume. They're here because of a variety of reasons. But essentially, they are imperialist, colonialists, whatever you want to call them. And so as a result, in the 1970s and 1980s, the key Palestinian political organizations, such as the PLO, for example, begin to turn towards terrorism, or if you want to call it asymmetrical warfare, anti-colonial violence, whatever you want to call it. They turn towards the idea of using targeted acts of violence against civilians. They will hijack airplanes. They will carry out bombings. They will try to make life complicated for the Jews that are in Israel in an effort to get them to leave, or at least at some level to get them to recognize Palestinian independence. This is, of course, what Hamas is trying to do today, right? Why carry out the October 7th attacks? Hamas was not trying to take territory, was not trying to occupy Tel Aviv or something like that. These attacks, the intifadas going on, right? These ideas of resistance, the way that they have been expressed is in terms of asymmetrical violence, understanding the environment that they're in as being a colonial environment. And this, again, is a direct legacy in many ways of 1967, when conventional arms fail again, and seemingly for the last time. Before we move on to talk about the actual war itself or the causes of the war, one last point about this. The violence unleashed by the PLO does not just affect Jews or Israelis, and I mean both of those categories because they do use it against Jews from the United States, Jews in Germany, things like that, obviously the Munich attacks. But it also boomerangs back upon Palestinian society as well. There is such a long history of resistance organizations using violence against Israeli civilians and Israeli security forces, and then Israeli security forces revisiting that violence upon Palestinians. And we're seeing this, of course, play out in real time today. So again, just to summarize, 1967 is, of course, a really pivotal moment in the history of the region, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Now, before we get there, again, just a kind of brief programming note. As we did with Suez, this episode today is going to be talking about the background context to the war. We're going to talk about what led down the path to war. Why did it begin in 67? Why not earlier? Why not later? Was there other options? And then in the next episode, we're going to talk about the fighting itself. So if you love military history, if you love hearing about T-34 tanks and things like that, we'll get to it in the next episode. This one is going to be more about the background context. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the causes of the war. Because 1967 is, in some ways, a really fascinating war, and it's one of these questions about, did it have to happen? Why did it happen? Could it have happened differently? One of the kind of broader analogies one could make is 1967 is kind of like a gunfight. And the Egyptians, in some ways, under Nasser, it's like they reach for their pistols, but then for some reason decide not to draw them or decide not to fire back. And so the Israelis are a little quicker on the draw, and the Israelis will strike the Egyptians first, and then we'll strike Jordan, and we'll unravel the whole situation later. Now, for many years, historians largely thought about this or understood this, at least Western historians, understood the origins of the Six-Day War as being the fault of the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser was obviously a dictator. Nasser had talked for over a decade about wanting to fight Israel, war with Israel, standing up to the Zionist occupier. And as we kind of talked about in our episode on Suez, because of his nationalization of the canal, because of the way that he gravitates more sort of into the Soviet orbit, Western sources tend to kind of read him as being, oh, he's just another dictator. Oh, he's a strongman. Oh, he's kind of like, as Anthony Eden would say, kind of like a kind of mini Hitler, and we need to sort of stop him in 1956 before he can really get going. More recently, however, scholars have begun to look at this question of what leads to war with a little bit more nuance. Basically, some of them have begun to see it as more of a situation analogous to World War I, which also had a lot of kind of rethinking, a lot of revisionism, right? You go back to 1925, what is the story of World War I? If you're in France, if you're in Britain, if you're in the United States, it's largely that those bad Germans under Kaiser Wilhelm, they just want to conquer stuff, and so they started the war. Again, historians looking at the Six-Day War have come to kind of view it in this sort of tragic way, in which there's no single party that kind of sets out to start the war. And there are a number of parties, including the United States and the Soviet Union, who are trying to put the brakes on war, who don't want war. But nevertheless, events just kind of carry themselves inevitably towards this episode of violence. And so many historians today would argue this is because of the alliance system. This is because of public pressure on people like Nasser, people like the Israeli leadership at the time. And so there are these kind of entanglements that one could argue lead us down the road towards warfare. For example, Gamal Abdel Nasser did not really seem to want to fight with Israel in the 1960s. He's often the guy in public saying, okay, we have to be strong, we have to be ready for the next war. But behind the scenes, he's happy to kind of walk that back, in part because he's not sure that Egypt is really ready to fight Israel in the 1960s. He's waiting for the perfect circumstances to come forward that make the war kind of a guaranteed victory. And so he tends to kind of want to postpone things until that moment is just perfect. Nasser, in this vision, is not really looking for war. Nasser has a lot of problems going on at the time. The Egyptian economy is kind of struggling. Nasser has thousands of troops bogged down in Yemen. So he's already got another war in his hands. He doesn't need a second one. However, Nasser also has to respond to his public, right? He's a dictator, but dictatorships are not independent of the sort of general mood of their populace. And especially if you want to seem like the rock star because you're the anti-colonial nationalist that's going to stand up to Israel, you can't afford to be weak or to be perceived as weak or backing down. Again, in this vision of the entanglement syndrome, the Israelis are not necessarily looking to start another war. There are individual Israelis who have designs on the West Bank who are thinking about, retaking Sinai. But most Israelis, including most of the political leadership in 1967, on the verge of the conflict, are thinking about security. They are hoping about using violence not to make their state larger, not to conquer new territory, but because they want to deter potential violence against them. Likewise, King Hussein in Jordan absolutely does not want war in the 1960s any more than he did in the 1950s. One of the major anxieties felt by the Jordanians, and especially the Hashemite monarchy, is, hey, we have this prize of the West Bank. We don't want to lose it. We are from the family that used to control what is today Saudi Arabia and Mecca, and we lost the holy city. We don't want to do that again with Jerusalem, which is the third holiest site in Islam. However, Hussein, like Nasser, also faces this kind of delicate balancing act. Now, in his case, it's a little bit different because he has the Israelis right there. He needs to come to some kind of way of living with them. But he's also ruling over a population that doesn't just advocate for Palestinians, but which is itself 2/3 Palestinian. Hussein's actions that lead towards the 1967 Six-Day War have to be understood in this context, right? He is responding to his broader public that, again, kind of boxes him into a corner. Finally, of course, there are also Palestinian groups that want war in the 1960s, but to what extent should we allow these groups to speak for the Palestinians as a whole? This is a conversation I have with people with reference to Gaza and Hamas all the time. Some people, friends of mine, say, oh, Hamas, all the people in Gaza, they all wanted this war. They all voted for Hamas. Well, there hasn't been an election in 20 years, and Hamas didn't run on, let's go attack Israel, let's go, kill kids and things like that. They ran on a platform of anti-corruption. And they haven't really allowed a lot of public discourse since. So how much do these violent militia groups, you want to call them anti-colonial groups, resistance groups, whatever, how much do they actually speak for the Palestinian people as a whole? As we saw in 1948, they didn't really speak for most Palestinians. So again, what we're going to see here is that political rivalries, particularly among the Arab states, that competition over water, which of course is something that's very important when you're living in the desert landscape, and poor communications all come together to create these sort of perfect conditions that will lead to this, again, explosion of violence, again, another round of Arab-Israeli fighting. Now, to speak a little bit more about specific circumstances, as in any conflict, some of the underlying causes of the war are long-term factors that previous wars had not resolved. The most basic factor, of course, is the fact that there is no Palestine. We had, as we talked about, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees displaced by the first war in 1948. What's supposed to happen to them? You either have to have the Palestinians return to Israel or to lands within the state of Israel per its pre-1967 borders, or you have to have some sort of territorial revision where outside of those borders there is a Palestine. There are also some regional dimensions that we've talked about over the course of this podcast. Arab leaders in neighboring states, of course, refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist. You can understand this in a kind of formal political sense. Jordan, Egypt, and Syria had signed armistices with the Jewish state, but not formal peace treaties. So we're not fighting now, but who knows about down the future? Today, North and South Korea have not signed a peace treaty. The Korean War is technically still going on. They're not shooting at each other, at least not in a major way. But the war isn't over. They haven't agreed to recognize each other officially. Some countries in the Middle East after 1948 never signed an armistice deal. Iraq and Saudi Arabia are technically at war with Israel in 1966. You can also look at this not just in a sort of purely military, diplomatic, political way, but you can look at it culturally. Not only do you have people in all of these Arab countries that are sort of demonizing Israel, talking about how Israel has no right to exist, but their leaders, when they speak publicly, call for Israel's destruction. At the 1960 UN General Assembly, for example, Nasser gives a speech and he says, quote, "The only solution to Palestine is that matters should return to the conditions prevailing before the error was committed, i.e. the annulment of Israel's existence." He's saying that at the UN. He's the president of Egypt. This is a big deal. In a 1965 speech, he adds that, quote, "The path to Palestine will not be covered with a red carpet or with yellow sand. Our path to Palestine will be covered with blood," end quote. Now, Nasser is a politician. He's got to look to be the part, to be the big anti-colonialist, the nationalist, the anti-Zionist. And so he has these clever rhetorical flourishes. These do help him maintain his popularity. What they don't do is convince Israelis that the existential moments of the 1940s are over. Quite the opposite. pretty obvious if you're saying the path to Palestine is paved with blood. Israelis should be ready to fight because you're coming for them at some point. Finally, while the presence of UN troops in Sinai had drastically reduced the Fedayeen attacks from Gaza, the porousness of the border with Syria and Jordan provided space for continued attacks by Palestinian militants, provoking harsh and often disproportionate Israeli reprisals. And we talked about this a lot in the previous podcast. We talked about the way that the Israelis tried to discourage the Egyptians and the Jordanians and the Syrians from allowing these cross-border attacks to happen, and how that often was experienced by civilians as violence and death and destruction. So a lot of what we're talking about is stuff that we already kind of covered, already talked about before. There are, however, also some new changes that take place. And one of the biggest changes is in terms of politics across the Arab world, which bring instability and enhances rivalries between the various Arab states and their political parties. Now, perhaps the most basic of these changes is something that we kind of talked a little bit about before, which is the triumph of Arab nationalism. After 1956, right, we talked about before 1956, there were several different paths to resistance, several different paths to anti-colonialism. Do we want to do fascism? Do we want to do sort of an emphasis on Islam? Do we want to do secularism? Do we want to do Arab nationalism? But Nasser's triumph in 1956 makes Arab nationalism the kind of dynamic spirit of the age, if you will, makes Arab nationalism the kind of the thing that everybody wants to be a part of, or at least most people. And what it does in the years after Suez is wash over the previously British-influenced or dominated Middle East and destroy a lot of those old regimes, that sort of older pro-British order in many countries, again, across the Middle East. In Jordan, for example, remember Abdullah by this point was dead. He'd been assassinated. And his grandson, the young King Hussein I, made the decisive step in March 1956 to break with his grandfather's patrons. He dismisses the British General John Glubb and other British officers who had occupied leadership roles within the Jordanian army. Remember, during the First Arab-Israeli War, the overall commander of Jordanian forces is a British general. He is in the service of the Jordanians, of Abdullah, but he's still British. He still cares about Britain. He's still taking actions on behalf of the Jordanians, but that also kind of really benefit Britain as well. In Iraq, the pro-British Hashemite monarchy, which remember had been founded by Faisal in the early 1920s, this monarchy is overthrown in a bloody coup in July 1958. Now, the resulting Iraqi republic is basically short-lived. After 5 turbulent years and no elections, in February 1963, we have another coup. This will be carried out by members of the Ba'ath Party. That coup didn't really solve that many problems. There would be a couple years of additional political instability, and in 1968 we'll have yet another coup, and this will eventually help bring Saddam Hussein to power. Lebanon experiences a short civil war in 1958 that necessitates American military intervention. Some of you are familiar with the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, of course, sending American troops to Beirut because there was a civil war going on in the 1970s and early 80s. That's not the first time American troops are in Lebanon. They were actually there in 1958, trying to, again, calm things down, trying to sort of create peace. We could also talk about Syria, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about that later, but basically Syria is also a mess. Syria will also experience a series of coups. So in the decade before the war, Arab nationalism seems ascendant. Of course, the question is, what does Arab nationalism really mean? Right, there's obviously a sense of pride in being Arab, in Arab accomplishments, and thinking back to, the kind of justification for the state and the purpose and what its outlook should be. Is it there for the glory of the monarch? Is it there to carry out God's word, to be Islamic? Arab nationalists would say, no, the basic point is that Arabs have a common interest together politically, and they share a common political destiny. That's great in terms of being an abstract theory, but what does that mean in practice? Nasser, as being kind of one of the original guys to achieve power and articulate this vision of Arab nationalism, to him, Arab nationalism is not just about brotherhood and unity, but it is also about modernizing the Egyptian state. And one of the ways that he does that, especially the more and more he moves into the Soviet orbit, is by using sort of socialist elements into the program of modernization. He will nationalize various industries. In places like Iraq and Syria, as they begin on this kind of turbulent path, as they overthrow that older British kind of order, the question is, what replaces it? Do you try to preserve the power of the older elites if they kind of switch allegiances? Or do you destroy them? Are they part of the problem? How important is Islam in the new Arab nationalist government? Right? Most Arabs, not all, but most Arabs are Muslim. Should government be secular? Should Islam and Christianity, to the extent that it's important, maybe in Lebanon, should that have nothing to do with it? We saw, of course, in our last episode how the Soviets become involved in the Middle East. Well, the Soviets are communists. There are native communist movements in these countries. Should they be a part of it? And then, of course, you have various complexities brought on by the ethnic and religious tensions that are already there. In Lebanon, you have Christians and Muslims. How do they work out their political differences? We have in Iraq, of course, as many of you know, Sunnis and Shiites. In Syria, we have Alawites. Finally, one last complicating factor is, as all this is playing out, Nasser is not just advocating the idea of Arab nationalism and I'm just going to sit back and allow it to kind of grow organically. Nasser will himself become involved in the politics of neighboring states. He will support pro-Nasserite forces in a variety of geographic and political contexts, including Yemen, as we just talked about. All of these kind of issues, all of this kind of, okay, we're going to Arab nationalism, but what does that mean? How do we adjust? What are our rivalries, the tensions going on? All of this turmoil essentially creates problems for the would-be rulers of these Arab states. If I am in Syria or Lebanon, what do I do to unify my people together? How do I get them to back me and support me if we have all of these confessional or regional or ethnic divides? So one of the main answers becomes anti-Zionism. One of the things that everybody in the Middle East agrees on outside of the Jews is that they don't like Israel, and Israel is kind of a colonial project. And so if you're Arab, to be an Arab nationalist is to be anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist. In other words, the structures, the political structures and dynamics of Middle Eastern politics inflame the Israeli-Palestinian issue, not because of Israelis or Palestinians, but because it's good for Arab politics in other places. A second related phenomenon is the illusion of Arab unity that follows in the wake of the Suez Crisis. In 1956, the Egyptians basically take on the Israelis, the British, and the French completely on their own. They don't want to do this. They reach out to Amman. They reach out to Damascus. They say, hey, wait, Israel just attacked us. Can you get involved in the war? And at that time, the leaders of the other Arab states say, no, we're not ready for it. We're not prepared for it. We don't want to risk it. And so Nasser faces these kind of incredible odds, 3 against 1. But in 1958, members of the Syrian Ba'ath Party basically invite Nasser to unite the two countries. They want to create what's called the United Arab Republic. And they actually give Nasser sort of political control over Syria. This idea of a political union across borders is something that is incredibly appealing to many Arabs in the run-up to the Six-Day War. Now, put a pin in that Syrian experience because they're not going to stay very long. They realize that Nasser is more interested in his own political goals rather than kind of pan-Arab nationalism, and Syria will actually withdraw in 1961 from the UAR. But as we get into the mid-60s, most people living in the Middle East are not aware of this, especially if you're not involved in politics. And so when, for example, Nasser calls in January 1964 for a pan-Arab meeting in Cairo to negotiate about a common position to Israel, this seems like a major step forward that could change the outcome of the next war. The Arab states agree to the creation of a unified Arab command under Egyptian leadership. They agree to standardize the group's weaponry so that they can better support each other, right? If we have a tank, we have to have the right size shells for the tank or for the artillery. We can't have different standards, different types of weapons. Even though Egypt at this point is getting considerable military aid from the Soviet Union, they will turn around and say to the Jordanians, to the Lebanese and the Syrians, look, we want this kind of broader multi-front war against Israel. We will give you some of our weapons so that you can fight and be better prepared. Now, this conference in January 1964 makes a number of other key decisions, and we'll get to those in just a moment. But the key point here that I want to make is that by 1967, Arab unity seemed to have overcome one of the major problems that had led to defeat in 1948. In the run-up to the Six-Day War, both the leaders and publics of the Arab states are confident in the idea of victory because they are united. Another way to put this is if you think about the idea of brinksmanship, the more convinced I am that I'm going to win if it does come to blows, then the less worried I am if conflict is going to break out. Now, speaking of confidence, we want to talk about a third factor that is somewhat relatively new in the run-up to the Six-Day War, which is the development of Palestinian politics. I mentioned in the intro that, of course, one of the takeaways from 67 is that Arab states can't achieve this victory on their own. We as Palestinians need to create our own institutions, need to carry out the struggle ourselves. The reality is that that is not an entirely new idea after 67. It's much more widely accepted. But the origins of these sort of Palestinian resistance groups date back earlier into at least the early to mid-1950s. Now, in 1967, they tend to be very small. They're founded in many cases by university students. These are kids coming from lower or middle-class backgrounds. They are educated. They are patriotic. And their thinking here is not that we are going to solve the Middle East problem on our own, but more that we can put Palestinian voices back into the larger Arab conversations about Palestine. We saw one of the issues that sort of happened in 1948 and then especially in 1956 was that Palestinians were largely sidelined from their own sort of saving, if you will. Right? The Egyptians, the Jordanians, they don't really want Palestinians to have agency in terms of controlling the course of politics. And so in some cases they're repressed. In other times they're supported, but almost, we're supporting you in a way of trying to kind of guide you and steer you where we want you to be. In the early 50s, however, Palestinians will again try to sort of relaunch their own independent politics. Now, an early example of this type of organization was the Movement of Arab Nationalists, or MAN, MAN. And this was founded in 1951 by the physician George Habash. There's other people involved as well, but he's the guy that's usually kind of singled out as the founder. MAN adopted basically a secular and socialistic political program, but at the heart of its philosophy was the notion that the Arab world needed to unite around the question of Palestine, that reversing the Nakba would be the ultimate expression of anti-imperialism, and so it was every Arab's duty to kind of buy into this program. Habash's group received considerable support from Nasser after 1956, but eventually it would fall apart after the defeats of the Six-Day War. Instead, in 1967, it was rebranded as the Marxist-Leninist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the PFLP. The PFLP would go on to become the second largest member of what became the PLO. And in the 1970s or 80s, if you were talking about this group, you would be talking about them in terms of hijacking airlines, And then, of course, they also are a player in the current war in Gaza. Another major organization that emerges from this moment in the 1950s is Harakat al-Tahrir al-Watani li-Filistini, better known today by its reverse acronym Fatah. Fatah can mean a number of things. It can mean conquest, victory, opening. But basically, it was founded in 1959 by young Palestinian professionals living largely in places like the Gulf states. The initial membership included people like Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, Khalil al-Waziri. And in its initial phase of existence, Fatah served as an alternative to the sectarian groups that were focused on things like Arab nationalism, socialism, communism, or Islamic groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. So Fatah was your kind of umbrella resistance organization. You know, we kind of take all types. We're not interested in breaking down into the weeds here. The primary goal of Fatah, instead of again getting bogged down in dogma, was direct attacks on Israel in the hopes that Palestinians could provoke a wider liberating war. Towards this end, Fatah announced the formation of al-Asifa, or the Storm, on January 1st, 1965. And over the course of the next year, it would claim to carry out over 100 attacks on Israeli targets, although Israeli security forces kind of poo-pooed this, said, it's actually more like 35. They're not quite as effective. They're not quite as strong as they make themselves out to be. In terms of military effectiveness, one can kind of agree with the Israelis that Fatah was not really that effective. So they end up being less of a sort of political player than they are a kind of nuisance that people like Nasser and King Hussein of Jordan want to kind of suppress. Right? If Egypt or Jordan is going to go to war with Israel, those leaders want it to be on their terms, not because some, kind of damned fools, so to speak, got involved and went and attacked some civilians, and now Israel's attacking us, and now the war has broken out, and the Israelis have kind of determined the timing of it, right? We want the inertia to be on our side. We want to be the ones that take the initiative. So again, Fatah is basically repressed in both Egypt and Jordan into the mid-1960s. This, of course, brings up one of the points that I've tried to make again and again over the course of this podcast, which is that understanding the situation in the Middle East as being either Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian misses all the complex ways that basically Arabs are fighting with each other or rivalries interfere with each other. At any rate, setting all this aside, with Nasser's defeat in 1967, Fatah would become immensely popular, and it is today the largest group within the PLO, and historically has been. Finally, I've been talking about the PLO a lot. We should probably talk about why it was founded and when it was founded. Interestingly enough, the PLO, which stands for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was not a sort of popular, organic, groundswell type movement, as these others were that we were talking about. But instead, it is in many ways the product of Nasser's machinations at the 1964 Cairo Conference. Basically, one of the other things that the conference wanted to do was to create a kind of umbrella organization that would kind of unify all these different Palestinian groups together, but which would do it in a way that would allow Nasser and the Egyptians to kind of supervise them, control them, sort of channel their activities in ways that would be advantageous for Egypt. As we'll see, these plans largely failed, especially after 1967. In 1969, Yasser Arafat would be elected chairman of the organization, and he would use this position to create his kind of own direction for the organization, his own legacy, which of course would be this turn towards terrorism or asymmetrical violence, as I've talked about. Okay, so far we've been talking mostly about politics, ideology, and strategies, but there's a fourth reason that we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that is also a kind of cause of the fighting, and that is water and border tensions. To make a long story short, as Israeli leaders contemplated the future of their state, they naturally began thinking of ways in which they could increase the amount of arable land. Israel is, or was, mostly a desert country. It's very small. The Israeli population was growing. So how do we get more land? The best option is not to go conquer it. The best option is just to secure more water and make more arable land. Now, as it happens, Arab leaders in places like Jordan and Syria were doing the same thing. We talked about this a little bit, how international negotiators, as they're thinking about how can we solve the Arab-Israeli problem, the idea of building dams and harnessing water flows was seen as a kind of cure-all, right? Everybody wins. Between 1953 and 1955, the American negotiator Eric Johnston attempted to find consensus for all the parties to share in the Jordan River's ample waters. Unfortunately, Johnston isn't able to come to a solution. And in 1956, of course, we have the outbreak of the Suez War, and that kind of disrupts any idea of some sort of common treaty or common understanding of how we're going to divide the water from the Jordan River. In 1959, the Israelis announced plans to divert the water on their own, drawing directly from Lake Galilee. Arab leaders reacted hostilely to the plan, and they decided in 1963 on their own diversionary scheme. And of course, because it's a river, if you're further up the river and you start taking out water, that leaves less water for the people that are further downriver, which in this case happen to be the Israelis. So what begins to happen is we have these border tensions that already exist. There's already confrontations over the DMZ. We already have these kind of Fedayeen-style attacks that are taking place across the border. But in the late 1950s, early 1960s, you get sporadic episodes of violence based on who is trying to do what with the water. In February 1964, for example, the Syrians began building some of their canals. They're going to divert some of this water. And the Israelis reacted by basically shooting artillery at it. You're going to try to steal our water, we're going to blow up your construction project. By the time you get to 1965, periodic artillery duels, firefights, bombings by airplanes fighting each other, having dogfights, right? This is a common occurrence, even though there is technically an armistice between the two sides. More broadly, if you're thinking about what leads us down the course ultimately to war, if you're an Israeli, the constant tensions on the border, the constant fighting, again convinces you that the Arabs have not accepted 1948. That your life in Israel is existential, and that at some point they are going to attack you. They are going to try again to revise the conclusion of the first Arab-Israeli war. As these border tensions play up, Israeli leadership in the mid-1960s becomes increasingly convinced of the need for a more formal response. And in particular, after the death of 3 policemen in a mine attack on the Israeli side of the border in November 1966, the IDF decides, let's mount a massive operation against Palestinian villages. Let's go show the Jordanians we mean business. If you kill Jews, not only are you going to die, but your friends, your relatives, people from your village might die. If you're a villager and the Palestinian resistance organizations show up in your town, you better boot them the hell out of there. Do not, by under any circumstances, support them, because we will boomerang that violence back onto you. Now, the Jordanians were, of course, aware of this. This isn't the first time that the Israelis had carried out these type of reprisal attacks. The Jordanian king Hussein was very actually worried about it in the wake of this kind of killing of these 3 policemen. And so he actually writes a very personal letter to the Israeli prime minister condemning the attack and offering his condolences. Hussein doesn't want a war with Israel. He wants to decrease tensions in 1966. How are you going to get the letter there? Israel and Jordan don't recognize each other. They don't have mutual embassies. No problem. I got it. I'm going to give it to the U.S. Embassy in Amman. That guy is going to send it along to the Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol. And as it happens, the American ambassador in Tel Aviv was a guy named Wally Barber. Now, unfortunately, this all happens on a Friday night. And of course, in Israel, Friday night is a big deal. Friday night is shut down everything. It's the beginning of the Sabbath. The idea of people going home from work early at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, very normal. And so Barber says, you know what, it's Friday afternoon. There's no way the PM's going to be there. This letter isn't that urgent. I'll just leave it on my desk and I'll give it to him on Monday. Unfortunately, before that can happen, on the morning of the 13th, the Israeli response began with a massive incursion of 10 tanks and 400 soldiers into Jordanian territory. Their mission was to take temporary control of a series of Palestinian villages that they believed were sort of staging areas for some of these attacks and this mine planting. And their reprisal is going to be to literally destroy the villages. They will occupy several of them, including the 5,000-person village of Samu. As they are doing so, they spot a column of Jordanian troops that are moving towards the area, and they set an ambush, and they will kill 15 Jordanian soldiers, and they will injure 54 more. As they are blowing up most of the town, they will destroy not only 120 homes, but they will also wound over 100 Palestinian civilians. The Samu raid has massive consequences. In addition to sparking global outrage, they demonstrate to many Palestinians in the region that the Jordanians are not capable of protecting them. Palestinians will take to the streets not to protest the Israelis who did the attack and carried out the violence, but to protest the king, because the king has failed to live up to his end of the bargain to protect Palestinian lives. This is one of the fundamental kind of processes or influences or movements, pressures, if you will, that push the Jordanians into the idea of war or make it seem like they are more eager for war with Israel than they otherwise might have been. Hussein has to embody the will of his people, who are again 2/3 Palestinian. He cannot look like his grandfather Abdullah as someone who was negotiating with the Israelis, trying to live alongside the Israelis, trying to kind of de-escalate tensions. Hussein realizes, I have to choose a side between Israelis and Palestinians. I can't keep trying to kind of live with both sides. Now, as he's trying to kind of do this calculus, he's also realizing that the nakedness of the Israeli attack, the complete disregard for Jordanian sovereignty, maybe that means that the Israelis have designs on the West Bank after all. Maybe they're not going to hold up their end of the partition bargain. And so again, as we get closer and closer to 1967, Hussein will move more towards the anti-Israeli Entente led by Nasser. The other big fallout of Samu is that it convinces people like Nasser that Israel does intend to attack Jordan. Maybe Israel is planning to attack Syria. That's where the hot spots are, right? We've got UN forces along the border in Sinai and in Gaza, so that's not a big hotspot anymore. But if the Israelis are going to go attack the Jordanians, then I, as Nasser, have to be on top of that. I, as the big pan-Arabist nationalist guy in the room, I have to be doing things to stick up for the Jordanians, even if behind the scenes I really don't like Hussein. I don't get along well with him. Where all this is going is that when the USSR gives faulty intelligence to Nasser in the spring of 1967 that Israel is about to attack, Nasser looks at Samu and says, well, of course they are. They've already been kind of telegraphing this. Now, the second immediate factor that will lead to war in 1967 goes back to the turbulent nature of Syrian politics. I mentioned before that the Syrians had kind of decided in 1958 to try to merge with the Egyptians to create this united Arab Republic. They were very, very pro-Nasser, at least in 1958. But this union does not last very long. Far from bringing the benefit of Arab unity, Nasser basically just extends the reach of his dictatorship, He will begin purging all of the Syrian political parties. Eventually, he will purge the Syrian kind of political apparatus. They will ban rival parties. They will begin nationalizing Syrian industries. They will abolish the Northern Executive Council, which was the last distinctly sort of Syrian political institution. And after he tried to take over the secret services the following month, the Syrians decide to rebel. And so on September 28, 1961, lower-ranking members of the Syrian army launched their own coup, and they announced that they are withdrawing from the UAR. And as this happens, Nasser kind of says, you know what, I've got other issues. I don't have time to spend on this. That's fine. You go back to being Syria. We'll go back to being, they still call themselves the United Arab Republic, but it's basically just Egypt. But there are still kind of these tensions there, not just between Egypt and Syria, but especially within Syrian politics. For about a year and a half, Syria becomes this kind of political vacuum. There is a succession of coups until some of the Alawite members of the Ba'ath Party, led in part by a guy named Salah Jadid and another guy named Hafez al-Assad, Bashir's father, seized power in March of 1963. Once they are in control, they immediately purge their own party, and they begin to purge Syrian society, and they start setting up a kind of ruthless, totalitarian government that held power, as many of you know, until late 2024. Just a note, Assad overthrew Jadid in 1970. We'll talk about that towards the end of the next podcast. At any rate, the reason this was so consequential is that far from consolidating power, Syria remained this kind of delicate coalition of rival parties and powers. As we talked about before, the only thing that really united all the disparate Syrian factions was that they hated Israel. And so if you are Jadid and Assad, and you are trying to kind of build up popular support for your dictatorship, you are going to lean into the Palestinian cause in the 1960s in order to kind of, again, sort of generate popular support for yourself. The Syrian dictatorship will reach out to Fatah and will say, we're going to support you. We're going to give you funding. We're going to shelter you. When there are those moments of conflict along the DMZ, the Syrian regime doesn't say, okay, well, how can we work this out? Let's have an international mediator come in. Let's talk to each other. Let's set up warning systems. They say, no, we are going to lean into this to show our people that we are fighting the Israelis. Now, another dynamic to this, again, becoming the spirit of anti-Zionism is not only sort of puffing your own chest up and talking about your own actions, but it is calling into question the commitment of other Arab states to the Palestinian cause. For example, at the December 1966 Arab League Defense Council meeting in Cairo, Syrian delegates tear into their Jordanian counterparts. They say, look, this Samu raid happened. What did you do in response? Why are you guys so weak? Why are you always backing down? Why aren't you tough like we are in Syria? One of the big kind of questions that the Syrians level, and it's one of those questions that's more an attack than it is a question, they say, look, why don't you allow Iraqi and Saudi troops to be stationed on your soil? They'll help fight against the Israelis. They'll help prevent a repeat of what we just saw. The Jordanians are kind of practical here. They say, well, actually, Iraq and Saudi Arabia are technically at war with Israel. If we allow their troops to enter our country, the Israelis are going to blame us and they're going to attack us, and we don't want a war with Israel. The Jordanians, by the way, also play this game. They say, hey, Nasser, you're supposed to be, the big tough guy, the big Arab nationalist, the leader of everybody. Why are you hiding behind these UN troops? Why are you placating the Israelis? Why are you just sitting back on the sidelines criticizing us? We're the ones getting attacked. And so one of the things that begins to happen in basically all of the Arab capitals is that this rhetoric of competition, this rhetoric of questioning the commitment of the other Arab states to being anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist this boxes everyone in the corner and pushes them again into this expectation that we are going to stand up to Israel. In Egypt in particular, they have to figure out a way to do this without necessarily starting another war until they're at least ready for it. And so the Egyptian general and future Marshal Hakim Amer hatches a plan to save face in December 1966. Nasser is going to show everybody how tough he is by ordering the UN forces out of Sinai. He is going to reoccupy the peninsula with significant amounts of troops. He is going to reclose the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. The Israelis aren't really going to want to fight a war on multiple fronts. The international community isn't going to support Israel attacking Egypt as it had in 1956. And even if they do, the world community is going to, again, turn against Israel. Israel's going to be the aggressor. And so, even though this plan wasn't enacted formally in December 1966, it essentially became the blueprint for Egyptian strategy in 1967. Nasser is going to kick the UN out. Nasser is going to risk war and look like the tough guy for doing it. And if the Israelis do start a war, the UN is going to step in and end the fighting in a couple of days because they're going to see that the Israelis are the aggressors. And so just like 1956, even if we lose by starting a war, we still win because we look like we're not the ones that started the war. Nasser would again be the hero of the Arab world, and he doesn't have to risk that much. The only real hesitation Nasser has in December 1966 is related to timing. He has at this point about 50,000 Egyptian troops that are bogged down fighting an insurgency in Yemen. As I mentioned, the Egyptian economy in the mid-1960s, it is no longer the Paris on the Nile of the early 50s. It is struggling a little bit. And so for Nasser, even though he kind of wants to attack Israel at some point, the time is not yet right for action. That said, the board was aligned. These forces that I've been talking about, all these different dynamics, they're activated. And so all that remains is the right circumstances to kind of push everyone into motion. If you want to think about this as being a chessboard, we've set up all the pieces in the various places. The strategies are already defined. It's just a question of once someone moves into a particular space, this is going to trigger now a series of reactions. And that is essentially what will happen in May and June of 1967. And we will discuss these events in our next episode on the course of the Six-Day War itself. But that's going to be it for now. We hope you enjoyed listening. If you want to find further information about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or about other episodes related to modern European history, you can again, of course, find them on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. As always, we appreciate you having listened, and we hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.